Today on Moment of Zen, New York Times columnist Ross Douthat joins me to discuss his new book, Believe Why Everyone Should Be Religious, making the case that institutional religion is not just socially beneficial, but intellectually defensible. We discuss the decline of new atheism, the tension between traditional Christianity and Silicon Valley's techno-optimism within the New Right coalition, and whether AI consciousness points to something beyond materialism. Ross, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for joining.
Thanks, Erik, so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Ross, why this book and why now? You're talking largely to Silicon Valley, largely to a tech audience.
all future believing Christians, I'm sure. I've been reading the stories. I know, God is on the move. So I think that the two questions are really one question, right? That I think that we are in a really interesting cultural moment around religion in the US and the Western world, where we've sort of reached the end point, I think, of a period of secularization that started maybe roughly 20 years ago, started around the heyday of the new atheists, Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, et cetera, and really continued, I think, through the pandemic and then sort of hit its limit, I think. And you can see this in the numbers. You can see the number of Americans with, no religious affiliation had been going up, and now it's plateaued. And you have interesting data from some Western European countries that suggest there's an actual modest religious revival. And I think you can see it in intellectual life too, that we're not at the point of sort of, mass conversions to traditional religion, but we're at a point where the kind of new atheist case that getting rid of religious belief was going to make the world a better place doesn't really seem persuasive to very many people in 2025, given that the world does not seem to have become a calmer, more reasonable, and more scientific place as it's become less religious. And so I think you have a lot of people now who are sort of in the ante rooms of religion, kind of hanging around the threshold, interested in belief. A lot of people who've been raised without any kind of religious tradition, no Sunday school or Christmas and Easter church, who have spiritual impulses but don't have any tradition to connect them to. And so this is a book sort of written, it's written for everybody, like all books, right? But it's written in particular for people who are sort of in that kind of position, who might be spiritually curious, religiously interested, who might think that you have to basically, set aside or ignore reason or science to really become religious. And I'm sort of arguing against that idea. But I'm also trying to provide a certain kind of a blueprint for someone who says, oh, well, maybe there might be a God, but I have no idea which religion to choose or how I would even, go about being religious. What should I do next? So the book is partially an argument for why atheism and materialism are probably wrong and a religious perspective on the world is probably true. And then it's partially a kind of self-help guide for the curious almost believer, of which there may be more now than 15 years ago.
It's fascinating. You once claimed that Christopher Hitchens, or you claimed that he once routed you in a debate. If he were,
I didn't claim that he did. He did.
Yes. If he were alive today, do you think he would have changed his mind on certain things based on how the world has changed, or might he have dug in even harder? It doesn't seem like Sam Harris or Richard Dawkins have changed their mind much.
Well, you've had some interesting evolutions, right? So Harris has sort of tried to, as far as I can tell, make this really strong distinction between kind of Abrahamic monotheism, which he's like, it's just wrong. It's definitely wrong. I don't believe in any of that. And this kind of zone of spiritual practice and engagement that he thinks is compatible with science, which it is, I think. I think it's also compatible with believing in God, but that's sort of a separate argument. But he sort of entered into, a kind of spiritual but not religious zone where he's kind of a guru for people who want spiritual experience but can't bring themselves to believe in God. Whereas Dawkins, I think, has no interest in any of that, meditation and woo stuff, right? But he's become a tiny bit more sympathetic to Christianity because he doesn't like wokeness and he doesn't like fundamentalist Islam. And he feels sort of besieged by both those forces. So he'll say things like, well, I I suppose I'm a cultural Christian and I'll be sorry when Anglicanism disappears. I don't know how Hitchens would have evolved. I think he would have changed a lot of his political views, as everyone has done. Not everyone, but most people have done. But I think of his atheism as a kind of romantic, sort of would-be revolutionary atheism that was less interested in proving that God didn't exist and more in saying, if there were a God, I wouldn't obey him or serve him, right? He liked that idea of God as the North Korean dictator watching your every move. So that was very important to him. And I think that kind of atheism can survive a sort of changed cultural context. I think in his case, it's more likely that you would have needed, maybe an actual religious experience or something to sort of shift his path. But I lost the debate, so I was brought in as a substitute for this debate. I was really young, worked for the Atlantic. They were holding a debate with Hitchens then in his prime on a beach in Nantucket, and it was supposed to be him and Andrew Sullivan, who was, of course, the gay Catholic contrarian writer. And then Andrew had a conflict that weekend. He might have even been getting married. I'm not sure. And they were like, Ross, you believe in God. You can take on Hitchens. And I couldn't. He beat me. He just, he had his shirt unbuttoned to the navel and had a scotch in one hand and wouldn't even look at me, just sort of played to the crowd who were all there for him. But to the extent that I learned anything from that, the debate, his book was called Why Religion Poisons Everything or something like that. That's his subtitle. And I spent that debate trying to argue on his terrain and saying, no, look, religion has this positive effect and that positive effect, and you can't just sweep it all away. And, you know, I believe those arguments, but I think I sort of inherently put myself at a disadvantage. And I should have done what I try and do a bit more of in this book, which is start out by saying, well, look, the reason to take religion seriously is that, it actually has a fair amount of evidence on its side. It's probably true. And these questions about its cultural effects are sort of downstream of that.
Yeah. So instead of playing on his frame, you would have sort of played on your frame, or sort of changed.
Well, I mean, that's how you win. Right? It's regardless of who's right or who's wrong. If you're accepting the terrain that your opponent has staked out for you, you're obviously at a disadvantage even before you get to the fact that Hitchens was a brilliant debater and I was a child.
Yeah. And so for people who haven't yet read the book, what you just said is a surprise to them. The idea that religion is mostly true, or is a surprise to a certain type of person who he hasn't grown up with religion or has been sympathetic to some of the new atheist arguments. So square that circle, or explain that case just a little bit for people who haven't yet read the book, as to, who maybe grew up on Sam Harris or Chris Hitchens or Richard Dawkins as to.
Sure. I mean, I think the new atheists were always very effective, I think, at pointing out, the sins and crimes of religious institutions, which are, manifold and ample, and, pointing out questions and tensions and contradictions in particular religious teachings and doctrines and scriptures and so on. I don't think they got everything right in that zone, but I think that's a perfectly reasonable zone of argument and critique around religion. But you can accept those arguments and those critiques while also stepping back and saying, okay, but nonetheless, there are a number of good reasons to think that a basic religious world picture that says, look, the world is probably not an accident. It probably has some kind of conscious intentionality behind it. Human consciousness itself seems to have some sort of specific relationship to that larger intentionality. We have unusual powers and capacities that are hard to explain in purely materialist terms. And in fact, perhaps there's some mysterious relationship between consciousness itself and the very organization of matter. There's a lot of really strange and striking stuff in quantum physics suggesting a kind of independent and even primary role for consciousness in the organization of the material world. And then finally, you have, it's not just that you have reasons to think there's some kind of higher power. You have in the persistence of religious and spiritual experience, mystical experience, you know, eh, weird encounters, near death experiences, all this kind of stuff that's fairly disreputable. I think for the skeptic, it seems very disreputable. But I think as someone who grew up around people having religious experiences. I think at the very least, you have to say it's a really persistent and important part of human existence that is inadequately explained by reductive explanations. I think you can go a bit further, but you could say that at least. And I think when you combine those arguments, cosmos looks kind of designed. Consciousness seems to have this connection to the design, this capacity to understand it, maybe this role in sort of bringing it into full existence. And then, by the way, it sure seems like, gods and angels and so on are still speaking to us, even in a disenchanted world. I think those are converging lines of argument that, at the very least, make it quite probable that, it's worth going to church, saying some prayers, and trying to figure out what the architect of the universe might have in mind for your life. And I think there's sort of maybe an insufficient appreciation for some areas of sort of scientific and philosophical argumentation in the last 50 or 70 years, where I think the lines of debate have shifted substantially in religion's favor. And, probably at least some of your listeners are familiar with arguments about fine tuning the various ways in which it has turned out that our universe, its physical laws, its constants, and so on, seem incredibly precisely calibrated to allow for the emergence of stars and planets and life in ways that are, if you set it up against all the possible universes, are nearly a sort of, not one in infinity, because that's not actually a mathematical expression, but, let's say a quadrillion to one, right? And this has pushed the kind of materialist atheist perspective towards embracing ideas about the multiverse, saying, right, the way you have to explain this apparent design, and it really is apparent design of some kind, apparent conscious intention, that's what it looks like, is to say, well, we're just one of a quadrillion universes. And of course, we see this one because the others are all dead and there's no one there to see them. And, you know, it's a longer debate than one can have on a podcast about that. But at the very least, I think it needs to be recognized that this is not an argument like Galileo showing you the heavens in a telescope or Darwin figuring out evolution by natural selection. This is a rival metaphysical speculation that is largely unprovable, posits universes that are invisible to us, posits a near infinite number of them, all in order to sort of explain away the evidence of some kind of design or intentionality. And I think, at minimum, it changes the balance of the debate. It should lead you to give more credence to religious speculations, even if you aren't fully convinced. And that's before you get into other, I think, potent lines of argument as well.
Yeah, I that resonates. I think where a lot of people get tripped up is terms like design or architect. Sort of the implication often is like big man in the sky, as opposed to terms like emerged or emergent or sort of evolutionary. Sort of give way, imply more of like process, and that seems more sort of can resonate more with more people.
Yes, I mean, I think that Darwinism is a extremely successful, with I didn't do a deep dive into Darwinian debates in this book. I just sort of, stipulated that one can accept the consensus of evolution by natural selection and still see plenty of arguments to take the idea of God seriously. I think Darwinism was sufficiently successful that people tend to always look for Darwinian style arguments to explain any feature of the universe that bespeaks design. And so you definitely have this in different theories of the multiverse. People are looking for sort of processes of selection that would yield our seemingly calibrated and fine-tuned universe, right? And so you'll get theories of like how, every black hole generates a new universe, and over time that selects for universes that create black holes. And and this, I mean, there are all kinds of highly speculative arguments in this terrain. And again, I'm not saying that one should discount them, but they are often sort of trying to apply a very specific biological framework to cosmological questions where it's not at all clear that that framework applies. And they are also sort of not sidestepping, but like, I think one way to frame the fundamental question that maybe, is a little more palatable to people who get allergic to words like designer is to say, well, we have access to two kinds of things in the cosmos, in our experience. We have access to mind and we have access to matter. And what matter is actually a harder question than people quite appreciate, as some philosopher friends have impressed on me. But, matter, let's just say, is the material world, right? And mind is our direct apprehension of ourselves and the world around us. And the assumption of materialism, right, is that, mind is secondary, mind is epiphenomenal, mind emerges somehow from interactions of matter. But mind is, in fact, the primary thing that we experience. All of our interactions with matter take place through the lens of mind. Mind's existence is, in fact, very difficult to explain through sort of purely materialist explanations. They call it the hard problem of consciousness for a reason. The language of emergence tends to essentially kind of hand wave over some sort of magical thinking. It's like, well, if you say it emerges, then you don't have to explain exactly what the concrete material steps are, and nobody can explain what the concrete material steps are that yield this kind of experience. So I think mind is more resilient just in the immediate mind versus matter contest than some people think. And then when you sort of add in the fact that, again, you have a universe that looks as though it was structured and ordered in some particular way, and you have some kind of weird dynamic interaction between mind and matter at the quantum level, which seems to suggest that you need minds around for matter to take the shape it does. I think you're well on the way to a somewhat religious perspective, right? That, like, maybe in fact mind is primary, and you don't have to call it God yet, but maybe mind is more of a primary and fundamental force in the cosmos than materialism would have you believe. I think there's a fairly reasonable and plausible reading of the evidence that takes you there. And then the question is, can I tug you a bit further to say, well, what should we call this mind, capital M?
Yeah. Hey, we'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors. What does the future hold for business? Ask 9 experts and you'll get 10 answers. It's a bull market. It's a bear market. Rates will rise or fall. Can someone invent a crystal ball? Until then, over 41,000 businesses have future-proofed their business with Netsuite by Oracle, the #1 cloud ERP, bringing accounting, financial management, inventory, HR into one fluid platform. With one unified business management suite, there's one source of truth, giving you the visibility and control you need to make quick decisions. With real-time insights and forecasting, you're peering into the future with actionable data. When you're closing the books in days and not weeks, you're spending less time looking backwards and more time on what's next. If I had needed this product, it's what I'd use. Whether your company is earning millions or even hundreds of millions, NetSuite helps you respond to immediate challenges and seize your biggest opportunities. Speaking of opportunity, download the CFO's Guide to AI and Machine Learning at netsuite.com/Zen. The guide is free to you at netsuite.com/Zen. netsuite.com/Zen. The origins of this podcast were once just a dream. That dream turned into the podcast and business you are listening to today. Taking your business to the next level is a dream lots of us share, but too often it remains just a dream. We hold ourselves back thinking, what if I don't have the skills? What if I can't do it alone? Turn those what ifs into why nots and help your business soar with Shopify. Shopify is the commerce platform behind millions of businesses around the world and 10% of all e-commerce in the US, from household names like Mattel and Gymshark to brands just getting started. What if I don't have a big team? Shopify helps you handle anything, from website design to managing inventory to customer service to global shipping and more, all in one place. Marketing budget next to nil? Shopify's built-in marketing and email tools help you find new customers and keep them. What if I'm looking to grow my business in person? Shopify's award-winning point of sale connects your online and offline sales in the same place. Keen to start selling globally? Shopify helps you sell in over 150 countries, tackling everything from translations to global shipping. What if I need to boost sales? With 99.99% uptime and the best converting checkout on the planet, you'll never miss a sale again, only with Shopify. Turn those what ifs into why nots and keep giving those big dreams the best shot with Shopify. Sign up for your $1 per month trial and start selling today at shopify.com/momentofzen. Go to shopify.com/momentofzen. Shopify.com/momentofzen.
It's really interesting just to reflect broadly. There does seem to be a bias in society towards this kind of emergent view of how things work rather than this sort of great man of history. When a group of people or when people claim, hey, this thing happened because this group or this person made it happen, sometimes those are called conspiracies, as opposed to sort of like, there does seem to be this sort of, whether it's in politics or beyond, the sort of the default belief that, hey, things are either random or emergent or the results of a lot of complex processes that we can't even begin to understand or assess or deal with. And it's like beyond us, as opposed to just accepting, hey, sort of this man or this group or whoever made it happen. And so maybe that bias reflects us to also. It just sounds smarter.
Yeah, I think definitely there's a kind of anti-agentic bias in historiography, social science, all of these places, right? That is in some way, not directly, but some way connected probably to materialist and reductionist views. I mean, I think an interesting question is just sort of what people think about the most direct form of this, right? Like if you read, a book that someone writes, a play, if you read a Shakespeare play, any of these things, do you feel like you're encountering something that a self created? And one of the first podcasts I did about this book was with Tyler Cowen, the brilliant economist from George Mason, who is very interested in religion and friendly to religion, but is sort of resistant to going all the way with me, right? And I ended up having this brief argument with him about, did Tyler Cowen actually write his own books? Right? Because sort of reductive materialist theories of consciousness end up saying that consciousness is an illusion of unity, right? Who is experiencing this illusion? We'll set that question aside. It's an illusion of unity. And in fact, the mind is, sort of all these different programs running, doing different things. And there isn't sort of any kind of singular person. And, even that is not completely incompatible with some religious arguments. You have in different religions ideas about, different parts of the soul and different hierarchies within the soul. So all these things are never as neat and clean as one would like. But it's definitely the case, I think, that the materialist paradigm pushes you in the end towards saying, like Tyler did, well, I don't think that there was an I who wrote those books. I think a kind of collective process wrote those books. And again, it's unprovable, but when I read a book that I love, I do feel like I am communicating with an agentic self, and that there is therefore an analogy to be drawn between that experience and the experience you have living as a being in the world, possibly communing with the, you know, larger, perhaps omnipotent agentic self that created this story that we're inside.
I'll bring up Tyler in a bit because it was a fascinating interview. But first, I want to go back to Hitchens. And let's imagine a thought experiment where Christopher Hitchens, rest in peace, let's say he passed away at the peak of New Atheism popularity, or he was in a coma, only to wake up, 15 years later, or wherever it is in the world that we're at now. And New Atheism is not sort of at its peak among intellectual elite. In fact, the intellectual elite is sort of more interested in religion. Or Chris Richards was listening to this conversation. Fill him in, this imaginary Chris Richards, on what happened. Why did sort of New Atheism not work? Why was it why did it fail to capture the hearts and minds in a durable way?
I mean, one, I think you would say first that it was somewhat successful, right? Just in terms of sort of shaping discourse and influencing people. And it's not like Richard Dawkins is responsible for the long run decline in church going. That has more to do with all kinds of complex sociological factors, but certainly the New Atheists sort of hurried that along. So you do want to give them credit, right? They did help make the world in which we live today. The question is more like, why aren't people happy with the world that they made, right? And I think one obvious answer that, again, some of the new atheists who are still alive themselves would concede is that a lot of the things that Hitchens and others were rebelling against or arguing against and attacking, the sort of highly dogmatic habits of mind, belief in unprovable, invisible, supernatural categories, sort of a kind of collective hysterias, moral panics, and so on. All of these things that, again, they were sort of folding under the category of things that people who believe in God do, turned out to be just things that people do. Right. And honestly, I think that was obvious all along. You can find plenty of secular antecedents for some of the crazier things that have happened. But I think if you look at Western politics right now, and if you take sort of, the most extreme versions of politics are, let's say, hyper woke progressivism on the left and hyper Trump obsessed MAGA on the right. Both of those forms at their worst look, they look like forms of fundamentalism in the Hitchens style. Neither of them are especially religious. Yes, the woke will sort of nod to indigenous ways of knowing and spirituality and so on. And yes, part of the MAGA base is evangelical Christians, but clearly the main thing going on there are non-religious forms of politics that are more important to people than their religious identities. And they're just showing that it's not the problems with religion that the new atheists were critiquing are just, persistent human habits and follies that show up in societies that believe in God and societies that don't. Now, Hitchens in his book had this move because he anticipated objections like that, and he said, well, sure, you can see in, let's say, atheistic Soviet communism, you know, if forms of the same pathologies that I attack in religions. But that's because atheistic Soviet communism is also a religion, right? He would say the same about, certain forms of fascism or something, presumably, right? But once you've made that move, you've sort of emptied out your particular critique, like the particular critique that says it is belief in an all-powerful God that leads to dogmatism, intolerance, and reigns of terror. And if you then say, well, you don't actually have to believe in God to have those things, you just need to be dogmatic in some way or believe in some inevitable form of historical progress or something, then you aren't really critiquing religion anymore. You're just critiquing human nature. And I think that's, in the intellectual and social landscape, that's a big a big shift, that more people sort of see the world that way. They're more likely to say, okay, it's not 6-day creationism that's making people, you know, act like fundamentalists. It's just that, people are tribal and get hooked on ideologies and act like fundamentalists. And then the other thing that shifted, and this I think is, a little harder to prove definitively, but like if you look at just sort of the psychology of the secular world, like the psychology of secularism in the first decade of the 21st century was just very optimistic. There was this really strong sense, especially among liberals around the election of Barack Obama, but sort of generally that, like, the world was making progress. We were advancing. The darkness of the past was being left behind. Bill Clinton's bridge to the 21st century, the audacity of hope, and so on, right? And the reality is, it's just a little easier to be an atheist in an environment where you think secular history is going in some wonderful direction, right? Because then you have a kind of optimistic horizon. I don't think it's an adequate horizon, obviously, as a religious person, but it is a horizon to sort of orient your life around, to say, okay, we are working for this better tomorrow, and good news, the better tomorrow is coming. It's on the way. you know, fewer people, especially fewer secular liberals in the age of populism and Trump and a multipolar world and COVID and everything else, fewer people believe that. It's harder to believe in an arc of history that's just bending secular liberalism's way. And so once that disappears, then you're thrown back on the limits of atheism's perspective on the cosmos. It's like, well, sorry, we can't guarantee anything about the future. Life is random. You're an accident. Probably climate change is going to wipe us out if if Rocco's basilisk doesn't get us or whatever, right? And people get depressed, they get anxious. And like, I live among secular liberals. I always have. They're lovely people, my friends and neighbors. And you can see this shift. Like, people, young people especially, but people generally, were fundamentally sort of optimistic and future oriented without God 15 years ago, and today are fundamentally pessimistic and anxious and future negative. And that, causes some people to say, maybe we should, look again at the old religious perspective on the world, which didn't promise us immediate utopia on earth, but gave us a reason for sort of larger optimism, cosmic optimism. And that's what, in the end, the new atheism just really struggled to say, where do you get cosmic optimism if you've just lost an election and you think the bad guys are in power?
Right. Yeah, there was too much of this thinking that religion sort of accelerated or popularized this sort of hysteria or fundamentalism, when in fact we would have greater appreciation later on, is that in fact also serves as a check or a restraint on that same hysteria or fundamentalism, by sort of popularizing ideas like forgiveness and original sin and turn the other cheek, and that what would replace it was in fact worse.
Yeah, you get different versions of this on different sides, but definitely you can see certain forms of wokeness as a kind of Christian view of like original sin, and sort of almost Calvinist view of how, depraved people are. Everyone is poisoned by white supremacy and structural racism and sexism and misogyny. But since there's no God, you can never actually like be forgiven, or you can maybe be transformed if you sit through enough Robin DiAngelo lectures, right? But there's no promise of God's grace. And then on the right, yeah, there is I would say, a distinctive lack of the quality of mercy in certain forms of right wing populism, Trumpian populism, and so on. That, again, none of this protects you from disaster, right? Like, I think George W. Bush was in many ways obviously a more moral person than Donald Trump, more idealistic, and not coincidentally more religious. But nonetheless, the Iraq War was still the greatest sort of deliberate disaster of my adult lifetime. We're pending whatever happens to the global economy under Trump, right? But, so the the new atheists were right that being a well-intentioned religious person does not prevent you from making grave blunders. But nonetheless, when I listen to, people in Trump's circle talk about their enemies, am I sometimes nostalgic for some of George W. Bush's evangelical inflected rhetoric? Yes, I am. Absolutely.
Yeah. And so that encouraged people like Brett Weinstein to say things like, hey, religion may not have literal truth. He's a scientist, he couldn't get, but it has metaphorical truth, or this idea that it, if you live in accordance with it, your life will be better. Clearly, it's adaptive. It's been around forever. Tyler Cowen has called himself a pro-religious non-believer. So there's a lot of people who say, hey, clearly, the rituals, the traditions, the sort of, there's some benefit to being, if not practicing, at the very least sympathetic to religious ideas, or trying to recreate some of the benefits it brings via other means. But is that not enough for you?
Well, I don't think that's enough for anyone, right? I mean, this is the I shouldn't say that, right? I think that there are people who can make a choice to practice a religion without definitively believing it, and can come through the practice of that faith to an actual form of belief that, actually transforms their life for the better. That can happen, absolutely. I think the Cowan-esque religion-friendly perspective on reality and civilization is correct, right? I'm glad that, Tyler appreciates the Bible and, the great cathedrals and, what the Mormons do for social solidarity in Utah. Like, he's right. But you can't actually sustain a real religious culture unless you have a lot of people who take the truth claims seriously, right? Like, saying, I'm going to do this thing because it's an evolved and adaptive form of behavior is a move that really only a certain kind of intellectual can sustain, and even they can't sustain it for that long. Because even like de minimis religion, right? Like I'm not, you know, I'm not a super pious person by temperament, right? But even like I'm Catholic, right? The basics of Catholicism is like you got to get to mass on Sunday, you got to go to confession twice a year. I've got a bunch of kids. You got to get your kids to confession. Like just this weekend, I have to reorganize our schedule to drag 3 of my children to confession because it's Lent and they have to go to confession, right? Like all of these things, they're challenging obligations, and I'm quite sure that I would not be able to sustain again, even just like the sort of bare minimum practice of the Catholic faith if I didn't have a strong sense that God is probably real, Jesus of Nazareth probably was raised from the dead, and the bet you're making is a bet on those possibilities being real, not just good news. Your endorphins increase after a certain kind of calisthenic prayer, and your relationship with your wife is 10% better if you, sit in a church with her for an hour a week. Like that. That's just not. It's not sufficient. It's a good spur for a certain kind of person. I'm not saying this that spur is necessarily bad, but you gotta have more. You have to persuade people in Brett Weinstein's position or Tyler Cowen's position or, your audience, whoever's position, that there's a good bet to be made on the idea that when you pray, someone is listening. Because that's just a much, much stronger spur to practice. Like when you die, you are probably going to meet God, a being like God. We don't have to put a label on it. You're going to meet a being, and that being is going to have some questions about how you lived your life, and you should be ready for those questions. I think that's just a much more powerful basis for a religious culture than a kind of evolutionary account of how one might benefit from church going.
Hey, we'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors. Every time I hop on the 101 freeway in SF, I look up at the various tech billboards and think, damn, turpentine should definitely be up there. And I bet I'm not alone. In a world of endless scrolling and ad blockers, sometimes the most powerful way to reach people is in the real world. That's where AdQuick comes in. The easiest way to book out-of-home ads, like billboards, vehicle wraps, and airport displays. The same way you would order an Uber. Started by Instacart alums, AdQuick was born from their own personal struggles to book and measure ad success. AdQuick's audience targeting, campaign management, and analytics bring the precision and efficiency of digital to the real world. Ready to get your brand the attention it deserves? Visit adquick.com today to start reaching your customers in the real world. Again, that's adquick.com. Any founders out there? I'm guessing your moments of Zen look a little different. You find peace in extending your runway, building and shipping faster, nailing your investor presentations. If you're looking for more of these moments of Zen, you need Brex. Brex built a simplified, scalable financial stack just for founders. In fact, 1 in 3 US startups already use it. Brex offers high-limit corporate PARBs with built-in expense software plus high-yield banking with 100% liquidity. Everything you need to grow faster. Trusted by 30,000 companies, including the fastest-growing AI startups to global enterprises with trillion-dollar market caps, Brex helps founders spend smarter and move faster in 3 key ways. 1. Fast, simple cards and banking that extend your runway. 2. AI-powered expense automation that accelerates building. 3. One scalable global platform that grows with you. Because Brex knows that Founder Zen means less time on finance and more time building. Get started at brex.com/grow. Again, that's brex.com/grow. In an age of AI and big data, your personal information has become one of the most valuable commodities. Data brokers are the silent players in this new economy, building detailed profiles of your digital life and selling them to the highest bidder. With data breaches happening frequently, these profiles aren't just fueling spam. They're enabling identity theft and putting your financial security at risk. But what if there's a way you could opt out of that system entirely? Incogni is a service that ensures your personal data remains private and secure. They handle everything from sending removal requests to managing any pushback from data brokers. What I trust most about Incogni is how it provides ongoing protection. Once you're set up, it continuously monitors and ensures your information stays off the market. Want to extend that peace of mind to your loved ones? Incogni's Family and Friends plan lets you protect up to 4 additional people under one subscription. Take control of your digital privacy today. Visit incogni.com/moment and try it risk-free with their 30-day money-back guarantee. Take your personal data back with Incogni. Use code MOMENT at the link below and get 60% off your annual plan. Again, that's incogni.com/moment.
I want to bring this conversation a little bit to AI, because there's a lot of people in my audience who believe that whether it's in the next 5 years or next 20 years, that at some point AI, or what they're referring to as AGI, is going to be able to do basically everything better than people can do. Basically, almost every single intellectual or creative, even cognitive function can be done better. Almost like, what we did to Neanderthals or something, like just a new species basically coming in that just outclasses us basically in every, by order of magnitude. And so some people criticize that idea and say, hey, they're just, they think AGI is just a new religion, or they're just religious about AGI. They just have faith in this thing that might not happen. But I'm curious to get I'm curious what you think about AI and how you think, or AGI, and how you think it plays a role in this religious conversation.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting, but I'm somewhat like, I shouldn't say somewhat, I'm very agnostic about the future of AI. I read a lot in this area. I don't think, as a word cell, I ever can quite grasp the sort of shape rotator perspective on how LLMs and AI models really work. But I try to have some sense of what's going on and what the frontiers are. And I accept that really smart people think that the remarkable advances of the last couple of years are going to accelerate. I sort of have to fold that into my mental model of the universe. So I do take it very seriously. I think the questions it raises around religion, and well, there's a few interesting questions, right? Like, so one question is, when people envision AI as a kind of successor species to us, do they imagine the successor species as being conscious in the way that we are? And in my conversations with AI people, I find there's a certain slipperiness here, right? Like, on the one hand, you will get people who say, "Well, no, I mean, we don't understand consciousness. We don't we're not building consciousness because we don't understand it. We're just building machines that can do things, right? And all that you need to get to a world where AI takes over in some way is, whatever kind of programming and, purpose develops in them, without having a sort of sense of I, thou, whatever consciousness may be, right? But then on the other hand, if you continue the conversation, then there's slippage, right? Like, if you read like what was it, the Sam Altman blog post on the merge, right? From 2017, where he's, basically saying a version of this successor species thing, right? So this is, how are we going to relate to our successor species? I mean, he's talking about AI like it's going to be conscious, right? Like that, and that maybe that slippage just reflects how hard it is for people to talk about imagine a non-conscious intelligence, right? You just slip into these human models to talk about it. But I think it reflects a kind of basic uncertainty around the project, where you have people who are reductionists, right? Materialists, who think, ultimately consciousness, all that we can fully know about consciousness are outputs. And so we should assume, if we get a certain kind of output, that consciousness must be in there. It must have emerged. We don't know exactly how, but, certainly acts like it's conscious, so it will be. But you also have people who think that, no, we're just going to get this kind of hyper intelligent thing without ever, resolving anything about our own consciousness and how it emerges. But to me, there's a way in which there is a kind of like, I've written this, but there's a kind of summoning aspect involved here, where you're like, it's not that, I mean, there are people in Silicon Valley who are sort of, there is a kind of weird, sort of new age supernaturalist edge to some of what they're doing. But for the people who aren't, even them, there is a kind of summoning. It's like, we're going to construct this thing. It's going to act like a human being, except way smarter, right? It's going to do everything we can do and more. And then at a certain point, we're assuming that a self will come to dwell in it. And we don't know exactly how, but we think that's going to happen. And as someone who thinks that the self, the mind, has an existence independent of the material, I don't rule that out, right? Like I don't say here, as a Christian who believes I have a soul and you have a soul, that the AI can never have a soul. I mean, maybe it could have a soul. Maybe, we don't know how beings acquire souls. I also believe, in things like demons, right? So there's a lot of different ways that you can you can have a spirit inhabiting something. But yeah, I just think it's really interesting terrain, and I think neither the people involved nor some of the outsiders like me have fully figured out what the terms are. Like, what are we defining as consciousness versus intelligence, right? Like, these are distinct categories. How do they overlap? People will talk about intelligence the way they talk about consciousness, but they're different. I don't know. There's a lot there. I mean, I do think, though, last thing, if you can get, let's say you can get AGI that does everything humans can do, and you put it in a robot body and it can do what we do in the real world too, but we think it's not conscious. Some people would say, well, this makes a pretty strong case for materialism. I actually think it runs the other way. I think it makes a case for the weirdness of consciousness, right? Because if it's essentially, you've created like a highly intelligent P zombie, right? To use this sort of, like, a P zombie is, a being just like you and I, but does everything we do, but just a stimulus response, not, there's no sort of conscious agency behind it, right? So, okay, so AI is like a super intelligent P zombie. Why aren't we P zombies? Why do we have this thing going on inside us that is not zombie like, this sense of will and imagination and choice and just sort of, direct experience? It makes it more mysterious, not less, if we can build equivalents to us that aren't conscious but do everything we do. So that was a lot, but it's I clearly I don't have a definitive take on this, but it's a very interesting landscape, to put it mildly.
Right. And it's part of the broader sort of set of ideas of transhumanism that tech has become excited about, whether it's we just talked about AI, but whether it's Brian Johnson's Don't Die or this other sort of,
Right.
yeah.
I mean, Brian Johnson is just a Mormon who, right, like, got fair. I mean, someone made the joke on Twitter the other day. It's like he left Mormonism behind and discovered a new religion where you attain eternal life while refusing alcohol and caffeine. And it's like, oh, and next he's going to develop like a garment to wear, a special garment that's good for, I don't know. I mean, maybe that's unkind to Brian Johnson. Well, but so on the transhumanist, so this is the place where definitely I think the kind of digital transhumanism, not the Brian Johnson make your body live forever, but the people who think we're going to upload our minds to the cloud and live forever that way. Those people actually do need to solve the hard problem of consciousness in order for their plans to work. And I'm pretty skeptical that they will, right? Like, for them, it actually makes a huge difference whether AI is sort of has a self in the way that we have selves, because they're never going to bootstrap their way into digital existence if you can't somehow construct an actual digital self. If they just, like, take their life in photographs and upload it to the AI, they're not uploading themselves to the AI. They're just dying, right? So they need, like, Ray Kurzweil or whoever. I don't know who the current. I mean, well, even Altman in that. I think Altman. I don't know what you think. I think Altman thinks he's gonna maybe live forever as a silicon god or whatever. He really needs to solve the hard problem of consciousness before he can pull that off.
I want to segue or have the last 15 minutes be focused on the new right, a topic which you've spent a lot of time exploring and writing about. But first, I'll start with kind of a intellectual question, or a high level question, which is, what do you think Nietzsche got wrong in his critique of Christianity, and particularly his comparison of it to, or description of it as a slave morality? Because there's a strain of thought on the right that says, hey, the bad ideas of the last century, communism and then sort of wokeness, were sort of this, slave morality run amok, whether it's on the economic class side or the social identity side. And maybe they take what you said seriously, which is, hey, Christianity is a foundation for some of these ideas, and maybe the root is a problem, and we need some more master morality. I'm butchering it a little bit, but
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, obviously, like, some of it just starts with the fact that, I think Nietzsche was wrong not to believe in basic premises of Christianity, right? And certain things flow from those premises, right? If you believe in the God who has revealed himself in the Old and New Testament, then you're going to have a different attitude towards the poor and weak and vulnerable and suffering than a kind of pagan master morality would have, right? So I think Nietzsche is the fundamental error, right, is in not seeing the sort of the truth of Christian ideas about equality and mercy and sort of and the dignity of the weak and so on. And that, from Nietzsche, some of that is slave morality, in the sense that it says, like, your slaves are your equals, and you shouldn't whip them mercilessly to achieve some kind of like great man's goal. It puts a limit on you know people sort of, yeah, it sort of imposes limitations on people of great capacities. It says you may have great capacities, you may be able to do great things, but you cannot treat weaker people in certain ways along the way, or you are wicked and evil and liable to damnation, right? And I think that's right. I think, evidence of the 20th century after Nietzsche, without calling him a Nazi, like, he's not a Nazi, right? But, like, there are places that right wing thinking goes that are understandable from the point of view of, like, a philosophy that essentially says we're going to put no limits on the strong. You have to put limits on the strong, right? So that's step one. I think then what Nietzsche misses, and I should say, like, there are certainly versions of Christianity that reflect his critique, that are sort of, that can't take their own side in an argument, that sort of have, contempt for great achievements and so on, and are sort of, to put it in Tolkienian terms, right? A Christian culture should be able to support both the world of the hobbits and the world of Gondor, right? The world of sort of high civilizations and great achievements. And a Christianity that just says everyone has to live as a hobbit is going to look a bit like Nietzsche's critique. Nothing against hobbits, but it's not the fullness of what humans can do. But I think in the end, what Nietzsche misses is that there are these hierarchies in human life. There are, people who do more and achieve more and so on. But the saint, the ultimate type of sort of Christian perfection, is not a falling off from the hero. It is the next step of advancement beyond the merely sort of this worldly heroic, right? So from my perspective, the saints, the martyrs, Christ himself, they are more super than the Superman, right? And the religious line, your power is made perfect in weakness. That is actually the revelation that true Christianity offers, right? That it's not that the great man isn't great in some ways. It's that there is a further greatness that gets you closer to core truths about reality that should discipline the great man and should provide some kind of aspiration beyond mere mastery of the world. But I don't think Christianity, rightly understood, should be opposed to mastery. It should be trying to sort of hold in balance the idea that mastery is good, but it is good in a particular place, in a particular framework, with goods beyond it. And much of Christian civilization, I think, had this quality. If anything, Christian civilization did not do enough, probably pre-Nietzsche, over hundreds and thousands of years, to restrain the excesses of the masterful, right? It doesn't do enough to restrain the medieval knights who go around killing and pillaging. It doesn't do enough to restrain the crimes of the conquistadors. but it is trying to hold in balance a world where people build kingdoms and people build cities and people do great things and create works of art, while also saying that the highest thing is sainthood. I don't know. That's at least a partial response to that.
Yeah, no, the balance there is critical, and it's interesting because you see it playing out on the new right, which you've been chronicling. You had Steve Bannon on the podcast. You had Mark Andreessen on the podcast. We had Curtis.
Yes, not someone else. We had someone else. One of my colleagues interviewed Yarvin, so I can't interview Yarvin for a while. You can only interview Curtis so many times.
Yeah, exactly. I wouldn't have imagined in 2020 that Curtis would be in the New York Times just in a few years. Evidence of how much things have changed. So what do you make of sort of where the coalition and the new right is going? You've chronicled the tensions between the MAGA right and the tech right, very practical grounds. Maybe we're seeing it play out right now with sort of on the economic case, but certainly on sort of metaphysical or philosophical, or there's a lot of fractures. The new right.
Yeah, well, two things, right? So one, I think longer term, there is this fundamental tension that you can get if you just go listen to my interview with Bannon after listening to my interview with Andreessen, right? Which is that the kind of tech right, allowing for the presence of Christianity in the tech landscape, does have a presence, obviously, maybe a growing presence, but the tech right is fundamentally more Promethean, more Nietzschean, less likely to accept any limits, right? And the Christian in the end has to say there are some limits, and we can argue about exactly what those limits are. But once you get to the point of sort of things like transhumanism being on the table, the Christian and the Promethean are going to come into conflict. AI and so on. Like all of these technologies provide plenty of, or radical genetic engineering, right? Embryo selection. All these things provide big points of potential tension. I don't think that's what's playing out right now in the Trump White House, though. I think the tension in the Trump White House, I'm still, or the tension around conservatism, is more like about sort of your attitude toward contemporary America. And it's sort of like, again, to put it in right-wing terminology, it's like, are you red-pilled or are you black-pilled, right? And the red pill says, well, you've got to recognize like the progressive power structure as this force in American life. You have to be willing to use the levers of power to fight the left more fully than conservatives have in the past. You have to be aggressive in the culture war, all these kind of things, right? But you can be red-pilled and also say, but basically, like, America, America's not in the worst shape in the world, right? The Pax Americana is worth preserving in some form. It needs help and needs alteration, but it should be preserved, right? And the whole system doesn't need to be overthrown and purged. Whereas if you take the black pill, maybe you're going to say no, like things are much more far gone than that. And you need to be willing to essentially accept all kinds of potential chaos and disarray and damage that affects not just like a progressive institution that you're targeting, but the whole economy, the whole of society. And you see this in the trade debate with tariffs and stuff. Like there are people on the right defending Trump whose attitude is basically just like, America sucks. We're a bunch of financiers and, people doing DoorDash delivery. That's our whole economy now. There's nothing else. There's nothing worth preserving. And if everyone has to get poorer for a while in order to rebuild, so be it. And same thing in foreign policy, like NATO, global alliances, there's nothing there. We just need to pull back to North America, maybe take Greenland and, and rebuild, right? That's I think the tension. I think that's a really important tension. And Trump has impulses in both directions, but like his trade stuff is it's welcomed by the black pilled right. It's like, yeah, we don't need your crappy consumer goods, right, man? We don't need your tech, you Silicon Valley guys, right? Like you're responsible for, you're in bed with China too. You're responsible for, stripping the heartland and destroying our manufacturing base. And a recession, bring it on. That's not my view. I think that's the wrong view. But I think that's the That's the manifest tension. It's like, you know, American empire, is there anything worth saving there? Yes or no, right? All those kind of questions.
Well, maybe in closing, I mean, do you think JD Vance is going to be loyal to? Is going to be more red pill or more black pill, or how do you make sense of him?
I mean, he's the vice president, right? So he's operating in the paradigm in the world that Trump creates. I don't think you can be president and be black pilled. That's basically my view. I think that JD, I mean, again, without sort of over imputing ideas to him, I think you can see both impulses in his public rhetoric, right? That, like, if I would say if you read his speeches, he's more red pilled, and if you read his tweets, maybe he's a little more black pilled. But like, if I were giving him or any future Republican contender advice, I would say, you know, don't take the black pill. You can't win elections and govern America. Even if the black pill were correct, we would just be screwed, and there wouldn't actually be, like, you're not going to rebuild America by inducing a major recession, and all you're going to do is lose the next election. I don't think that's really what people in the Trump administration want to do. But I think that, like, getting out of a purely negative mode on contemporary America is necessary to win and govern in what is a democratic society where, most people are not convinced that everything that happened in the last 40 years is a disaster.
Let's wrap on that. I want to be mindful of time. The book is Believe: Why Everyone Should Be Religious. I highly recommend it. Ross, thanks for coming on and having a fascinating conversation.
Thank you. This was great. I really appreciate it, Erik.